The Great Awakening was one of the most significant events regarding religion in the 18th century. It was full of emotional religious revivals that spread all throughout the colonies. Tension between the established churches and rebellion set the scene prior to the events in the Great Awakening. This was the time for religious reform and to change the way people thought about religion. It also affected the future of education in America, such as the creation of Princeton, Brown, and Dartmouth, which would become some of the most prestigious education institutes in the United States today. In 1775, the two most prominent churches that were established throughout the 13 colonies were the Anglican and Congregational Church. These two forms of Christianity were divided among the colonies. In Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, and a part of New York, Anglicanism was the official faith, while the Congregational Church was predominantly in all New England colonies except Rhode Island. The Anglican Church, or also called the Church of England, served as a kingly authority and was often forced on by British officials, although many colonies opposed the church. Since the Anglican Church was not as emphasized like it was in England, it fell short on its promises. In America, Anglicans were short-handed since there was no resident bishop. Although they tried implementing an American bishopric, many non-Anglicans violently opposed it, which just added to the tension in the rebellion. In the New England colonies, the Congregational Church, established by the Puritans, grappled political issues as the beginning of the Revolution against the Crown in England erupted. During this time, another form of Christianity developed called Presbyterianism. However, it was not made official by any of the colonies. In America, colonies were divided on whether or not they should support the king. Anglicans naturally supported him, while the rebellion erupted in the New England colonies.
The Great Awakening was known as the first spontaneous mass movement of the American people. It was said to have, quote, swept through the colonies like a fire through prairie grass. The Great Awakening was a rousing religious revival that occurred in the 1730s and 1740s. It was first ignited in Northampton, Massachusetts by an intellectual pastor known as Jonathan Edwards. There were also many new religions, called heresies, that were a cause of it because of their pressure on other churches to begin the religious revival. The new belief, which was created by Jacob Arminius and his followers during this time period, was that individual free will determined a person's eternal fate, not divine decree, which was the Puritans' belief. Old-time religion had also begun to be challenged by liberal ideas. In the South, the Great Awakening was viewed as similar evidence of erosion in the social constraints and difference that once held colonial society together. Later on in 1738, the spiritual life of the colonies was brought together by George Whitefield and his conflagration of religious ardor. The Great Awakening had emphasis on direct, emotive spirituality that undermined the older clergy and brought in many new ideas and beliefs. It led to the founding of new light centers known as Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth.
Education was valued by the English in colonial times. Although it was at the time basically for boys, it still shaped some of the very successful colleges we have today. It was very hard for the colonists to let go of the traditional values, and in turn that is the reason it took a while for them to accept girls in education. It was thought in that education was only fit for a few lucky aristocrats. When it came to their education, it flourished, and they were usually successful when they graduated. An example of this was in Cambridge, the intellectual core of England's Puritans. Religion also played a significant part in the school system. Teachers encouraged reading of the Bible to their students and having connection with God. They valued education very much in Puritan England. Their goal was to create good Christians. They didn't really focus on making good citizens. Towards the 18th century, a more secular approach did come about. On another note, there were primary and secondary schools established. The schools attempted to fit into the children's schedules, which were usually packed with farm labor that caused them to be drained. The South especially were very behind in this and did not have a very effective school system. Schools, mostly elementary, flooded children with information in the Middle and South colonies. This approach made it very hard for education to be accepted at first. Wealthy families also usually relied on private tutors instead of public schools. The schools in the colonies focused mostly on doctrine and dogma. Independent thinking was discouraged heavily, as during this time everything was very orthodox. They usually also focused on religion and classical languages such as Greek and Latin. When a student was to do something wrong, their punishment would be very harsh. The student would be birched, which is being hit with a switch cut from a birch tree. If someone was to go by the standards of current schooling, the instruction of colonial schools would be classified as poor. But many of the very important colleges currently did start during the colonial times. The first school free of denominational control was the University of Pennsylvania, established by Benjamin Franklin himself.
In all of the Great Awakening, there were 3 important people that helped to start and spread it. The person who was responsible for first igniting the Great Awakening was known as Jonathan Edwards. He believed that hell was, quote, paved with the skulls of unbaptized children. Edwards proclaimed that the folly of believing in salvation through good works and affirmed the need for complete dependence on God's grace, and he showed this through his works of art. His most famous piece was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which was a painting of the landscape of hell and the eternal torments of the damned in lurid detail. His preaching style was closely learned and reasoned, but his doctrines sparked a compassionate reaction among his parishioners in 1734. Another key person involved with the Great Awakening was George Whitefield. He spread the Great Awakening in 1748 by introducing a different style of evangelical preaching on America and touched off the conflagration of religious ardor that revolutionized the spiritual life of the colonies. He was a former alehouse attendant and a preacher of rare gifts. Edwards' brilliant voice boomed certainly over thousands of fascinated listeners in an open field. People used to say that he could make audiences weep merely by pronouncing the word Mesopotamia, and that he would, quote, give 100 guineas if I could only say, oh, like Mr. Whitefield. The last person responsible for igniting the Great Awakening was Jacob Arminius. Arminius was a Dutch theologian who preached that individual free will determined a person's eternal fate, not divine decree. His followers, known as the Arminians, threatened the Calvinist doctrine of predestination and challenged it by their new beliefs of free will. These new religions set a stage for a rousing religious revival which eventually became the Great Awakening.